Chloe, my first question is, your organization wrote an open letter to the major banks, and it said, don't fund dairy. Why?
Well, we're talking about a very specific type of dairy. We're talking about mega dairies, industrial dairies, when we talk about that. And that is because these large dairies have become major sources of pollution, both locally to the communities around them for air pollution and water pollution, as well as a major driver of climate change, accounting for close to 3% of total global greenhouse gas emissions just from this industry.
What was the response that you got from that letter? Did any banks say, okay, thanks for opening our eyes to this?
So we've had some openness from the banks. I think a lot of them do acknowledge the fact that dairy is a major contributor and a big part of their portfolio. But the action to actually change their funding portfolios and make sure that they're funding agroecological solutions, regenerative agriculture, the development of plant-based ingredients that are lower emissions, we have a long way to go to see those changes.
What would be a step one for the dairy industry to improve?
I think that, first of all, again, there are many folks in the dairy industry who are doing things right. We have small pasture-based producers where the animals are depositing their waste on the land and the nutrients are going into the soil, and you have the cyclical regenerative system that is sustainable. And so mega dairy, we need our policymakers. It's not in the hands of the dairy producers themselves. It's up to our policymakers to make it so that that type of dairy farming is more feasible. And the farmers who have these massive, mega dairies and corporations can transition either to a different type of less polluting agriculture or to a more sustainable dairy operation. So one example of a change that they can make, a lot of mega dairies are storing their waste as liquid.
Poop, right? Like let's just call it what it is. Cow poop, right?
Cow poop, cow pee. It's liquid, it's very wet. The cows and swine have the most wet manure. Wet manure also is the most methane generating manure. So if you store it in these wet systems where you're flushing everything in together, you're going to be generating methane from that. You're also generating ammonia and nitrous oxide and other dangerous pollutants for nearby communities and for accelerating the climate crisis. Instead, dairies can pursue alternative manure management practices where they're storing their waste in dry settings, they're composting it, they're depositing it on the land, ideally in a pasture-based system. So there are amazing dairy farmers out there who are showing us the right way. We're not saying to get rid of the dairy industry by any means. We're asking the federal government, state governments, those who are creating the policies and incentives that are guiding dairy farmers right now to the most environmentally destructive form of producing dairy, to redirect those subsidies and supports to support the right type of dairy production. And it would be in a more limited way. We only have so much land. We are producing a lot of emissions where there's less demand for cow's milk now than there has been before. And so some transition of dairy farmers to other types of agriculture is likely also warranted in this type of just transition.
All right, let's talk more specifically about what's a mega dairy producer, right? Like, do you guys have a specific number or a cap? This is getting to be too big, and do you have a number that's ideal? Okay, a small farm that has maybe, I don't know, you tell me, 20, 30 cows. Let's talk more specifically about how you guys define mega.
Yeah. So there's no formal federal definition or state definition of what a mega dairy is. So we would typically refer to a dairy that has 1,000 or more cows as a mega dairy. And that is really, really large. This has changed dramatically. In the 1980s, most dairy farms would have more in the range that you're talking about, 20 cows, maybe 100 cows. Now, even though we have a similar number of dairy cows in the US population overall, they are condensed into much fewer farms. And again, when they're condensed into much fewer farms with a really high number of cows, that means their waste is condensed. So I have a little Florida example for you. I did some back of the napkin math today. So one dairy cow produces 156 pounds of waste every day. So that's 156,000 pounds of waste every day in Florida. You all have 100,000 dairy cows. That is about as much waste as the city of Clearwater would produce in an entire year. So imagine having all of that waste and having 1,000 cows, 500 cows in one area producing the amount of waste that an entire city of humans would produce. That waste is ending up in waterways. It's ending up polluting our soil and air and water for neighboring communities. And so it's that concentration and the amount of cows. So there's no magic number of, oh, this number is okay and this number gets too big, because it depends on how much waste the land can accommodate reasonably without overflowing nutrients into waterways, causing eutrophication and algal blooms and fish kill-offs, things like that.
I appreciate your back of the napkin arithmetic. That's really helpful for my viewers. To keep it in Florida, it seems like y'all have been met with a lot of hostility. Florida's CFO, Jimmy Patronis, said that if he finds out any banks are leaning in this direction based on what you called for them to do, that there would be repercussions. So, and other officials too have been saying, like, not in Florida, don't try it. Would you say that Florida has been the most aggressive and the most the loudest voice in the room in fighting you guys on this?
There's opposition from mega dairies and the defenders of industrial dairy across the United States. The industry is spread out. So we have opposition, but we also have support, and our support is really among the people. I think policymakers and those who have, industry ties to the dairy industry may feel threatened by the work that we're doing to try to support the smaller dairy producers and diversified agriculture and regenerative production of dairy. But those producers, the people whose communities those farms are located in, the average consumer, we've found broad support for what we're trying to do.
Chloe, what's your job title? What's your area of expertise?
My job title is I'm the Senior Program Manager of Climate Friendly Food. So I work right at the intersection of climate, diet, and public health.
A moment ago, you said that there is a decrease in consumer demand for these types of products, for dairy. And I wonder if we could talk more about that. I wonder if that's because of things like soy milk, almond milk, oat milk that people are now gravitating towards. Do you think that is contributing to the decrease in demand?
I think so. It's hard to say. And just to be clear, there's a decrease in demand for milk. There's a lower milk consumption overall in the United States, but because cheese consumption has increased, the overall demand for dairy has stayed pretty constant. But we have some support in the US for the dairy industry that are distorting that market. And one example of another place that I work in is the area of school food, where cow's milk must be offered every day. But if a student wants soy milk, the only way school is required to offer that is if they have a note from a doctor saying they have a disability. And so many students who are lactose intolerant or who want some of those options at school, because of the way that our government regulations are set to favor the dairy industry over some of its competitors, those students are left with fewer options. So changing a law like that to just make it open, to give students and parents more choices about the type of milk that they could get into schools could be something that reduces the amount of dairy that's being served in schools, so much of which is being wasted, right? Which is being thrown away in the trash, all those emissions, all that pollution, just for it to be thrown away. So there are all sorts of solutions that we can point to help create more choices for consumers and a more fair market that also would result in decreasing emissions and decreasing localized pollution.
I don't know if you're following this trend, but there's a renewed interest and a growing interest in raw milk. Okay, so when you're saying to me, Mike, there are, and I think your point is well made, there are no alternative options in schools, and it's been like that forever. Like, kids have got to drink milk because it helps growing bodies, and milk does a body good. We know that. I think with this administration, there's going to be more of that push for raw milk, and I wonder if you guys have any research on that or any ideas about how that is going to affect emissions? Is that going to make the dairy industry pollute even more, or do you know? Or maybe this question is like totally off the wall. If so, you tell me.
Well, you know what, Mike, this is a good reminder that I probably need to brush up on raw milk because it hasn't been in the spotlight very much over the past 4 years. It's Not an issue that's come up in schools. For example, raw milk is not served in schools. Raw milk is not recommended in the dietary guidelines for Americans, food safety reasons. And so it's not something that I have a lot of expertise on from an environmental perspective.
Okay.
But I think, again, for schools, the fact remains that right now, kids in schools, they only can choose cow's milk at school. And so many of those kids should be able to choose soy milk, which is considered to be nutritionally equivalent to cow's milk by the dietary guidelines for Americans created by the Department of Agriculture.
I know that there is also kind of a movement of small farms and neighborhood farms, farm to table. You see them popping up at Florida at a lot of like farmers markets. So are you guys proponents for small farm startups? And I wonder if I could pick your brain a little bit about that, because that's the antithesis of what I'm hearing about mega dairy and these facilities that have, thousands of cows.
Yeah, absolutely. I think looking at markets where farmers have the opportunity to sell directly to consumers, like at farmers markets, for example, is a great alternative to this. But ultimately, again, our policies need to point to make that type of production more affordable and more sustainable, rather than directing, most of the subsidies and most of the supports to the mega dairies. There's such an economy of scale. President Trump's last USDA secretary, when questioned about this change toward consolidation in the dairy industry and what was happening to small producers, he basically said, look, this is America. You either grow big or you get out of the ag business. That's not the future that we want to see. We do want to see small farms thriving. We want to see communities feeding themselves, feeding their neighbors and other people in their communities. And it's ultimately our policies that need to shift in order to change that.
I wonder if we could name some names here. When I think big dairy, I think Hood, I think Borden, or maybe I'm off base here. Who are we talking about?
I'm not going to say the particular names because I haven't done my research of who the biggest players are in Florida and across the United States, so I'll opt out of that one.
All right, fine. What else should I be asking you? You tell me. Mike, ask me this.
Mike, ask me this. One of the I think the most alarming trends right now that's going on with the dairy industry is this merging of the interests of these mega dairies with fossil fuel or big oil interests. And so I mentioned earlier that mega dairies are storing their waste in lagoons. They call them lagoons, but it's a bit of a misnomer. It's a giant waste pile. And there's a technology that is intuitively appealing that can capture the methane emissions from this waste and turn it into fuel. But despite that intuitive appeal, we found that there are actually a lot of problems with it, and that it is one of the drivers that could further entrench both those mega dairies. Again, only the largest dairies can benefit from this technology, which gives them yet another competitive advantage against the smaller or pasture-based dairies who aren't storing their waste in this liquid format in the first place. And so essentially, we are entrenching this inherently unsustainable and unjust way of raising animals. We also haven't talked about the animal welfare aspect. For example, pasture-based dairy, they get to be out in the field, they're experiencing a natural life. In industrial dairies, these, cows are often kept confined. They're milked several times a day. Their babies are taken away from them as soon as they're from their mothers, as soon as they're born, so they can produce.
Is that your wheelhouse though? Forgive me. Like, do you guys talk about that sort of thing, or are you just environmental impact?
An environmental organization that takes an intersectional lens when it comes to environmental issues. And so we don't shy away from talking about the impacts on workers, the impacts on communities, the impacts on animals, the impacts on the local economy. So we really see environmental issues as connected to the broader social issues in society that people care about. So absolutely, I think animal welfare is not the only reason that we should be making decisions on how to treat a certain industry, but it certainly should be a factor. And we've found that most Americans care deeply that animals are treated humanely in the food system. They want to eat meat and dairy products, but they want to make sure that those animals that they're eating were treated humanely. So I do think that that's an important factor to consider among the environmental factors, the factors impacting farmers and local communities and workers that we've been discussing.
All right, let's go back to the Ask Me This, Mike question. Are you talking about like a system or a technology that like filters cow waste? Let's talk more specifically about what that is.
So they're called anaerobic digesters, and it's an oxygen-free environment where bacteria essentially digest the waste, and they create two components from it. So you have the liquid waste goes into this machine, this anaerobic digester,
Like a tank?
like a tank. You have methane emissions as one of the byproducts that they're capturing, and then you can, process that, sell it into like pipe it into LNG. You can use it as transportation fuel. But it also creates this other byproduct called digestate, and that's the leftover material. So I talked about that 156 pounds of waste from a dairy cow each day. You're still left with that waste at the end of the day, just in a more concentrated format. And that ends up being spread on field. But because it's more concentrated, it's more water soluble, it's more likely to cause water pollution.
But the industry sees that as the future, right? The industry sees that as a way to sort of stay in good graces of regulators or to try to save face.
I think you're right. I think that it'll be interesting to see how this plays out in the Trump administration, because under Biden, there was no effort the only effort that the Biden administration took to decrease emissions from the livestock sector was to subsidize things like these anaerobic digesters. So I think the industry did see that trend, and they saw the really lofty subsidies. The companies saw the prospect to sell credits into carbon markets that they can earn from the avoided methane emissions from these things. And so they were moving in that direction, but it's only feasible with a lot of government subsidies. Now we have Trump, we have DOGE coming in, Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency. If they're looking for ways to cut government support for inefficient programs, perhaps they would look at our subsidies for anaerobic digesters as one of those, and maybe it will lose some momentum. But even policies like in the state of California have been driving the increase of these anaerobic digesters as a carbon mitigation solution, despite the fact that we have limited evidence that they're really doing that. They're not doing it very much. They're really expensive. They only benefit the largest farms. They still entrench the fossil fuel industry and create new forms of pollution for communities who are having to live near these factory farms and the digesters that come into them.
Chloe, this is not a solution. It doesn't sound like a solution to me. It sounds like sort of a new problem.
Exactly. It is creating new problems. Not to say, and I do want to say that it's right to be looking at ways to reduce methane emissions. Policymakers are right to be looking at ways to reduce methane emissions. But this is a technology that's ultimately just going to entrench these underlying systems, both for fossil fuels and for factory farming, that ultimately are not going to serve us, that are not in the interest of our communities.
Is there a distinction between dairy cows and livestock, like cattle, beef cows, are both, I would imagine both are using this technology, not just dairy cows, but it would be for any cow farm, right?
Actually, this is predominantly for dairy and swine operations. There are a handful of beef farms that use anaerobic digesters, but beef waste is distributed more evenly across land. Beef are grazing more of their time. Dairy are more confined generally than beef, so they're more likely to have this liquid waste, and that's that most methane emitting waste. Beef cows live longer lives, so they're emitting more emissions just over the course of their lifespan.